Hello everyone and welcome to session 3 of the Security Summit. This session is titled Reviewing the 2022 Security Landscape. My name's Martin Beecham, I'm the Senior Security Analyst at GSMA and I'll be your moderator and host for this session. In terms of the agenda for today, I'm going to kick off with a few slides that really introduce the Security Landscape publication that GSMA have just released in time for Mobile World Congress. And we'll talk a little bit about that because it really positions the whole of the rest of the session. After that, we'll have a presentation from Daniel Krajewski, the lead security researcher at Kaspersky. And then we'll have a panel session that will discuss not only the landscape, but also the presentations that we've seen. So the mobile security landscape is available. We've got a few copies here at the stand if you want to come and grab one later on. It's been released, as I say, particularly in time for this Mobile World Congress. In terms of content, we were very keen to talk about how we build security resilience as an industry, not just as individual operators or suppliers or vendors into that space, because it's a team sport, security. So we very much talk about network security resilience in the report. And in terms of GSMA's role in convening the industry, there were a few highlights that I particularly wanted to draw out this morning. So, as I mentioned, a team sport, and very much the fraud and security groups that operate within GSMA are fundamental to building that collective knowledge, that collective experience and advice about how to protect our respective networks. There's a whole range of those working groups, member-driven, really bringing their expertise to play to build guidance documents as to how we run and operate and secure our networks. As I say, they cover a whole range of topics, from device security through signaling and interconnect, and through to baseline controls that really look across the whole of the network infrastructure. We had some content on the GSMA website looking at 5G and securing 5G as a particular place to bring all that information together. We've also, and we mentioned it in one or two of the earlier sessions, this information sharing. And one of our services that GSMA supports our membership with is the TISAC, so Telecommunications Information Sharing and Analysis Center. So a way to bring together expertise and share it in a safe and controlled environment. Similar nature, we've got a CVD scheme, Coordinated Vulnerability Disclosure Scheme. So when security researchers may find a potential flaw in the protocols or the definitions, they can share that with the industry in a responsible way, so that the industry then can decide, is this a real issue that we need to address, and remediate that problem before it becomes much more public knowledge. We've also got another couple of services here, one called the Security Accreditation Scheme, which looks at the SIM card and protecting the supply chain for the SIM card, and NISAS, which is more looking at the network equipment side of the supply chain. So that looks at providing some test and assurance of not only an individual product and its security, but the methodology by which the product's developed. So there's kind of two steps to NISAS accreditation. And on top of that, we will build our own control sets to strengthen that supply even further. It's not sufficient in its own right. This is about building a set of layered controls that together act to mitigate the security risks that we see. And finally, a set of GSMA publications. The security landscape is but one of those. There are others on particular topics, for example, open source software security. So the link is there if you want to have a look. You can access any of those documents. Some of them are member only, so join GSMA and you can get access to that whole bunch of other ones. Many of the ones here, certainly the concepts, are all publicly available, so have a look and enjoy. Moving on, the mobile landscape looks at 8 individual areas that we've selected. 5G and the enabling components of 5G, so the software side that we heard in earlier sessions, and that underlying cloud and virtualized infrastructure that supports that. We've looked at malware as a particular flavor of software, if you like. We also look at operational security, recognizing that telco networks are not just a telecoms operational network, they have associated IT systems as well. And that whole collective environment needs to be protected, and we talk about that in terms of operational security. We picked a couple of topic areas, Internet of Things, because it's growing, and you can see the forecast growth of IoT, so it's an important area. We continue to talk about signaling and interconnect as a particular security topic as well. A whole bunch of guidance to implement to protect signaling and interconnect. And we're also cognizant 5G gives us an opportunity to kind of make some step change in some of that signaling and interconnect. And finally, we look at supply chain, and you've heard much of supply chain in the previous session. So I'm delighted to now introduce Daniel, as I say, the lead security researcher at Kaspersky, and he's going to take us through a keynote presentation.
Thank you, Martin. Thank you very much. So, thank you everyone for assisting, either virtually or physically. You are all welcome to this mobile security threat landscape. In this session, I want to show you the Kaspersky perspective about all the risks and challenges that we are facing especially during the last year. So, all will be based on real-world incidents, based on real data, and I want to show you from how the adversaries are targeting not only mobile users, but also they are targeting the providers, telecom providers and related organizations. Additionally, I want to spend some time talking about how the evolving IoT landscape is shaping our ecosystem, especially in terms of security. And also how our adversaries are taking advantage of the complexity of our technical environment, for instance, by leveraging supply chain attacks in order to reach their objective. So, in this case, let's start with our mobile detections. These statistics are our unique detections for mobile malware during the last 3 years, as we have it in our recent published mobile threat landscape report that you can check in securelist.com. Of course, also check the GSMA report that Martin was mentioning, because you will find very, very specific and interesting findings there. And at first glance, the trend looks, let's say, acceptable, because we see that the trend is decreasing, which looks good. But aside from the number of detections, I think we must take into consideration some peculiarities of this landscape, specifically talking about the most prevalent operating systems and their philosophy behind. While iOS tends to be more in a closed environment, Android allows the users to install more third-party applications, so it's more open. And this has created a big difference in the malware that is targeting these platforms. For instance, Android seems to be plagued by cybercrime malware, albeit not free from APTs. But iOS seems to be in the crosshairs of nation-state-sponsored attacks. So It's important to notice that this last year we all see several news regarding the Pegasus project, for instance, that shed some light to the otherwise obscure world of iOS, zero-click, 0 days. And unfortunately, we will see more and more of these threats during this year. So from the attacker's perspective, a mobile device, it's almost an ideal target because it travels almost everywhere with their owners. They contain a lot of sensitive information, and infections in these terminals are really difficult to prevent and to disinfect. So unlike PCs or Mac, on which the users have the, let's say, have the choice to install a security suite, these solutions are either crippled or directly non-existent in iOS. So this creates an extraordinary opportunity for the attackers, especially those relying on state-sponsored attacks. But of course, mobile devices are not the only targets. During the last years, in the other side of the spectrum, we have the providers, telecom operators, and related entities, which during the last year have been exposed to a wide range of attacks, not only for cyber criminals looking for money, but also for APTs, like trying to get some kind of advantage through tactical or strategical advantage through espionage, sabotage, and related tactics. Let me show you some examples. For instance, we all know how ransomware is getting worse and worse. So these guys they have the resources. They are joining in bigger groups, in hermetic groups, and of course they are improving the big game hunting tactic. That it's basically going after companies that they perceive can pay huge ransom in order to recover their data. This incident happened like in 2000 last year, on which the ransom X paralyzed the Ecuadorian state-run company, telecommunications company, CNT, Corporación Nacional de Telecomunicaciones, at the point that the Ecuadorian government had to declare an institutional emergency. As usual, the main impact, it's not only for the entity attacked, but also the users became collateral damages of this kind of threats. This is something that we are seeing constantly, not only in cybercrime or ransomware operations, but also in APT operations. In contrast with cybercrime, that usually looks for money, these operators, APT operators, the so-called APTs, they are looking for information. They are seeking some kind of a strategy in order to produce intelligence against their target. So in this case, this is the Iran-linked seedworm attackers that have been targeting a lot of critical infrastructure during the last years, especially in the Middle East. And they seem to be focused also on telecommunications company that we believe that they are using in order to produce intelligence for very specific persons or groups of interests. Pretty similar to the operations from Lithium, aka Xane. Also, it's targeting critical infrastructures, telecommunication operators, and government entities. This group was first identified in, I think, 2018, on which they started to attack critical infrastructures. And during the recent month, we have realized that the group is not only growing, but it's retooling its arsenal. So we can assess with high confidence that the group is very active, and we will see more and more of their operations during this year. Of course, aside from adversaries, another important aspect in order to analyze a threat landscape is to know the ground on which it operates. So in the last years, there is like a trend shift from separated smart devices to a connected ecosystem, like several gadgets interconnected. And actually, we see that this is growing and growing. The last data that I have from 2020 is that the growing, it's like something like 23%. So the landscape, it's getting bigger and bigger. And of course, it's not the only percentage that it's growing, unfortunately. So this is the number of attacks that we have detected through our sensors. We have like a network of honeypots and sensors that they are receiving a lot of attacks. And the last year, we received 2.4 billion of unique and different attacks in this area. So, in addition to those generic IoT attacks, we are seeing how our adversaries are started to focus on specific smart devices. For instance, we see that several ransom groups are adapting their tactics in order to target smart home devices. But in addition, we still know that there are several botnets attacking new connected devices. For instance, one example is the Morsi botnet. So their botmaster was recently arrested, but the botnet, it's like working autonomously because it's super automated, and this botnet keeps getting new and new devices every day, so it's still active. So an additional point to finalize, it's the complex ecosystem of the mobile industry environment and how the adversaries are taking advantage of this complexity. For instance, by performing supply chain attacks. Although supply chain attacks corresponds a wide range of attacks, recently we have seen lots of, let's say, attacks leveraging software supply chain attacks. Probably you are all familiar with the Log4j vulnerability that affected millions of devices worldwide. So in our case, our sensors detected an average of 200,000, 300,000 impacts a day. The day right after this vulnerability was disclosed, we received like 1.4 million regarding trying to exploit this vulnerability. And I think this is a clear example about how not managing properly the software security chain can have really negative consequences. But to achieve that level of control, business needs a trusted partner, a partner that has a proven technology, a reliable, a strong technology, and not only investing a lot in research and innovation, that's what we do at Kaspersky, but also by fostering collaboration with other partners and entities so we can have a holistic approach to cybersecurity. And only by then, we will be achieving cyber immunity. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much, Daniel. Delighted now to introduce the rest of the panel. So, Daniel, if you feel free to take the seat, and the rest of the panelists, if you'd come up, take your seats, that'd be fantastic. Joining us today, we have Justin Williams, Executive Group Information Security at MTN. We have Alex Leadbeater, Head of Global Applications and Futures at BT. We have Preston Miller, Director at Unit 42, Palo Alto. Colin Murphy, Senior Cyber Security Advisor with Huawei. So welcome, one and all. Thank you. So we're going to go through a few questions that are related to the security landscape and to Daniel's presentation, and really delighted to hear both operator views and those companies that are in the supply chain and vendor supply chain for networks. Earlier on, I talked about the Telecommunications Information Sharing and Analysis Center, and I'm really interested to hear the panelists' view as to what extent you see the industry currently working together in information sharing of threat intelligence, how we can do more, and how you've seen the benefits of information sharing. Justin, I was going to start with you, please.
Thank you. So sharing of information is incredibly important. We hear a lot about how attackers are so good at sharing information. They find a weakness, it very quickly spreads, whether on a commercial basis or otherwise. As defenders, we have to work more closely together. So we do that internally within the organization, within our group of companies. We do it within the regions in which we operate, and then we use, through GSMA, the sharing platform to share on a global basis. You know, when it comes to sharing of threat intelligence, we're not competitors. We need to be defending as one, and we need to be doing it better and on a more automated basis. What we find is these platforms provide more detailed and more specific intelligence than what we get through other vendors, where you might just get a few IOCs. So incredibly useful, and I see it growing in importance.
Thanks very much. And Alex?
Yes. Thank you. So I think one of the things we're going to see, and there was a lot of talk about virtualization earlier and about open source software, is we are going to see more of a trend where vulnerabilities will affect an increasing number of networks. So obviously through things like the TISAC that GSMA run and others, we have some building blocks. But I think historically there has been perhaps a national security resistance to share openly, certainly cross-region. As we move more into the multi-vendor environment that certainly Ian and others were talking about for Open RAN, if that is to become a reality, which hopefully it is, then we are going to have to get better at this, both as an industry, that's the operators, so some of those threats are going to be operational side, some will be vendor vulnerabilities, and some will be wider ecosystem. So I think we have the tools, but I'm not completely convinced so far that we've utilized them particularly well. I think as an industry we could certainly do better.
Thanks very much. And Preston, what's your view on this information sharing?
No, thank you, Martin. When it comes to information sharing, there cannot be too much communication. It's incredibly important, something that at Palo Alto Networks we do with our customers certainly, so that when one customer sees an incident, all customers gain the benefit, thereby increasing their own security while helping others. That concept also applies today, especially when we're at a mobile conference talking about connectivity. As technology gains connectivity and impacts additional platforms, and in general has a wider scope, so too do the threats. And for that reason, it's very important that we do not operate in a silo where we're not communicating or sharing information. It's critical that that information is shared in an actionable way so that investigators and incident responders like myself can effectively conduct an investigation to assist corporations in responding to today's threats.
Cool, thanks very much. And Colin?
Thanks, Martin. It's interesting, actually. The banking industry has been doing that for about 20 years, if not more. And if you talk to anybody in that sector, they get great value from it, and it's actually, and they have a mature approach to it, and it's extremely important. And I think the telecommunications industry is catching up, I think, as Alex said, and has more to do, but it's really encouraging to see, just to mention, the competitors working together to collaborate and share information. And I think that's the key here. We've heard all morning people talk about collaboration. The reality is we need platforms through which we can collaborate, actually. And GSMA as a platform is a shining example of that. Just to give one other example, maybe, and I didn't see you mention it earlier on, so maybe I'll share it with the group here, is the 5G security knowledge base, which again came about as a cross-industry global collaboration between vendors, between operators, and of course we had regulators and standards bodies all around the table figuring out what good security looks like in the context of 5G and what controls should be put in place to mitigate those threats, and have come up with extremely useful, detailed documentation that operators can use to configure and address those risks. And I think we see in the future that platform being used to kind of develop an ecosystem that will then allow us to use things like the knowledge base as this kind of measurable benchmark that operators can use. So I think it's very encouraging to see TISAC, and actually the healthcare sector have followed suit recently, very recently. So it's very encouraging, and we'd like to see it grow and further participation in it.
Perfect. I mean, that's that team sport we were talking about earlier. Daniel, you've had a rest from your presentation now. What's your view on information sharing?
Yeah, basically, I think no company could afford a serious security program without embracing information sharing or threat intelligence. Threat intelligence is not only good in order to understand our adversaries, it's not only good to understand their operations and if they will affect to our sector, but it also very useful in order to shape your security program, because you can adapt the security program of a company based on real world data about what the adversaries are doing. So that's why I think threat intelligence is not only to speeding incident response, not only to know our adversaries, but also it can help adapting our security. And I think this is key, like adaptable security. And I think it's pretty important. Yeah.
Perfect. Thanks very much, all. I want to go on to one of the other topics in the security landscape, which is looking at particularly the role of software, arguably more important now than ever that we focus on software security. And there's been a lot of activity in the last few years to define the concept of a software bill of materials, that kind of menu of option, a menu of ingredients that make up the software, so that you know the exact composition of your code. You know what libraries are in use, you know what utilities it uses, etc. And so I'm really interested in the panel view, and perhaps we'll start with Alex, about what you see as the benefit of having a software bill of materials, particularly things like in reacting to software vulnerabilities and perhaps managing better the supply chain of software.
Thank you, Martin. I think, again, this will be one of the products of virtualization as we move forward. So if we look at things like the Log4j vulnerability, the amount of effort that was required in what is basically still a 4G deployment environment to figure out how many systems, how many sub-functions were affected by that was extremely complex. But what we were looking at was still a predominantly tin-based architecture. As we move to 5G, we move to Open RAN, we are going to have more vendors in the supply chain. We're also going to need to look at essentially faster automation of onboarding. So whereas we've got used to legacy equipment with a relatively static software base, we are going to have a dynamic environment where new vendors will come along, new services, new products. So we have to have a more fundamental grip on exactly what is in our networks. And by this we mean probably not quite in the minute, but we're talking about over weeks rather than years in terms of static network. So we've got to have a certain level of dynamic sort of assessment of what's in there. But also, we are not going to be in a position where we can test and sort of onboard in perhaps the way we've done traditionally, where you take your equipment, you put it in a pen test lab for several months. If you're going to onboard virtual functions quickly, rotate them, commission on a Monday, end of cycle at the end of the week, a little quick, but that's the sort of way that the media and the market wants to go. Software bill of materials will be key to understand the security threat of that. We certainly are not going to be able to do it by doing manual audits. It's just far too slow. So I think it really is a key plank, both of the landscape report and something we are going to have to do more of going forward.
Thanks very much, Alex. And Justin, I know a topic close to your heart. What's your view on software bill of materials?
Absolutely. I think traditionally software has been a black box in the environment. You kind of scan it from the outside, you hope you get a view of what's in there, and vendors often treat it as some kind of secret source that was a competitive advantage for them over other vendors. So getting that insight into what's going on there was always really, really difficult, and having those conversations with them was quite uncomfortable. So with software bill of materials now and it becoming increasingly industry standard, I think the US has been quite key in driving that forward. That now allows us to go back to them and have those conversations and say, you know what, this is going to become a condition of doing business with us. This is something we want in our contracts. You're going to have to supply it to us. every time you supply a new build of your software, you need to give us this recipe of everything that's inside there. And then we can take that and feed it into our vulnerability management platforms and have a much better view of what's going on in the environment. We always tell the business we cannot defend what we don't know about. And in the past, we didn't know a lot of what was inside those black boxes. So I'm really, really positive that this is going to help us moving forward. And the sooner the industry adopts it, the sooner all of the vendors need to come to the party. And then it's not us asking for something different, we're all asking for the same thing. So yeah, I'm hopeful that this is going to make a big difference.
Very interesting, the operator view. Preston, do you have a view?
Absolutely. Thank you, Martin. So a software bill of materials is really important. Something that, as time has gone by, is becoming increasingly more important. Software developers use a combination of their own proprietary code, but also code that is open source or commercially open source. And as they create the final product, you as the consumer receive the application without necessarily knowing what's in it. And what the issue it becomes is when CVEs are released related to a specific vulnerability or specific library, you as the end consumer have no knowledge whether your application that you're utilizing in your environment is impacted. And that's a blind spot that needs to be addressed. And a software bill of materials is one step in the right direction to address that risk.
Colin?
Thanks, Martin. Maybe let me give you a little bit on the vendor's point of view. I mean, Huawei, as you know, has customers in about 170 countries around the world, and we have thousands of products. So traceability for us is extremely important. And we've worked extremely hard, actually, at developing the ability through our vulnerability management program to, where we're now at the stage where we can trace any software component anywhere in the world within 2 hours. And any hardware component, it takes a little bit longer, about 8 hours. But the software bill of materials is a critical component of that effort. And by the way, and I think Alex touched on this, a software bill of materials on its own, it doesn't really have that much value. It needs to be linked to your tools that allow you to then do things. And that, I don't think that we're quite there yet. And there's some work to be done whereby the operators and others will have that linkage so that when they get this bill of materials, that they can integrate it into their tooling that allows them then to perform remedial action or identify, pinpoint precisely where a particular component is. And I think we've a lot of work to do there. And with that work, I think it's encouraging to see is starting to happen. And we support it absolutely.
Yeah. Thanks very much, Colin. Daniel, do you have a view on software bill of materials?
Yeah, my colleagues have been making very good points, and I think I just will add that as security, part of the security is to have control over the assets. I think as BOM, it's like a good approach to solve that. But I just wanted to add regarding this that perhaps it's also important to extend that in order to the automatization, because sometimes the timing on which a vulnerability is exploited and the time that we have to react, it's very short. So I think that there should be a component or of automation of this, let's say, inventory of software billing of materials.
Yeah, thanks very much. That sort of a machine-readable component, so you can integrate it into those other systems. Thank you very much. Daniel, you touched on this in your presentation, so maybe start with you on this next one, which was looking at one of the topics in the landscape is looking at malware, so malicious software and ransomware as a particular flavor that we've seen extensively through the last year or more, particularly with FluBot, and as a case study in the landscape report looking at FluBot particularly. So I'm interested in, to what extent you see this as normal. Is this something we should expect forever? Or maybe it's exceptional, maybe it's peaked, or maybe not. What's your view?
Well, unfortunately, from my point of view, it's something really expected. because we have been talking about cybercrime operators and other type of adversaries during a lot of years. We have been seeing how they are professionalized, how they are diversifying tasks in order to commit specific frauds or attacks. And this is not going to stop. I mean, at this point, the cybercrime world, it's super mature, and it should be considered as a business. And as business, these guys want their return of investment. So I think this is expected.
Sure. Thanks very much. And Alex, what's your view? Maybe we'll work down the panel, but
Yes.
Alex.
I mean, I think as people said in some of the other presentations earlier, as more and more people's life becomes digital and goes online, and the number of IoT devices we each have that's part of that digital life increases, there is going to be a natural migration, certainly from the perspective of an operator, from effectively criminals looking at how do I extort money or gain money in a non-digital form to a digital form, because that is their only path. So I think that's one trend that we have to remember underneath. And the second, I think, is that perhaps we are reaching a peak point, or that is my hope with some of this, in that there is a lot of insecure IoT out there that has been very much the focus of that compromise. As we start to raise the bar on IoT security, I would like to think that while we won't necessarily see the nation-state actor type attacks decrease, some of the lower value, frankly, we shouldn't really have had those problems in the market, type vulnerabilities, ransomware and malware, will start to drop off. And yes, we'll still see big groups with a lot of money, as Daniel talked about, people re-weaponizing their attack tools. But we'll see it go down to a smaller number of actors that at least may make it a little bit more manageable. But I can't see it disappearing anytime soon.
Interesting view. Yeah. And, Justin.
Malware has been with us for a very long time, and I don't see it going away anytime soon at all. I'm not quite as optimistic in the IoT space. I think, consumers still make their choice largely on price and features, and security is generally not considered one of the key features. So they're going to go into a shopping center on a whim, pick up a device, take it home, plug it in. It may be vulnerable when they buy it, and it may never be patched ever, and they may not care. So I don't see that changing either. Within the enterprise space, I think there's still a lot of reason for threat actors to want to gain access. That's not going to change. They're going to keep using different methods and varying their types of attacks as often as they can. There's been a lot of talk of ransomware. Yes, ransomware is still there. Starting to see the crypto mining malware make a little bit of a comeback over the last 3 months. I think ransomware is perhaps decreasing slightly as they're seeing governments and other entities go after the ransomware groups. I think with crypto mining malware, we've not seen anybody go after those guys. So when that gets discovered, it gets removed, but there's little consequence. So it'll be very interesting to see what happens over the next 12 to 18 months.
Preston, I'm sure you have a view on this topic.
I do. So unfortunately, in terms of cyber threats, malware, ransomware, certainly expected, to answer your question, I think it's only going to increase. Unfortunately, a lot of these, one of the advancements, I would say, or evolutions over the last several years has been, for example, just taking ransomware, for instance, has been the introduction of affiliate programs. And so what this allows is for cyber criminals that aren't as technical savvy, perhaps, join as an affiliate to a ransomware gang and leverage their technology to impact victims, gain money through ransom, and then the original ransomware operator gets a cut of the extortion. So things like that, specific to ransomware, we're going to continue to see basically lowering the barrier of entry so that there are more opportunities for less technically savvy cyber criminals gain entrance into this into this into the cybercriminal arena. Furthermore, we continue to see threat actors evolve their techniques to continue to maintain a robust ability to impact and create more victims, more opportunities to make money. And so, for example, we're starting to hear about phishing kits that have been upgraded to account for MFA, for example. So for a long time in the industry, we've been encouraging MFA as one of the best solutions in terms of securing an account, right? It's not just username and password anymore, you also need to have MFA. Well, threat actors are starting to adapt to that, and there are phishing kits that are being developed that leverage different techniques to attempt to bypass MFA or gain the token and use that as part of the authentication process. And we're just going to continue to see that type of evolution. So as defenders to these attacks, we also need to adopt that same mindset and be able to evolve as well to be able to counteract what we're seeing.
Fantastic, thanks very much. And Colin, your view, please.
I don't want it to be all doom and gloom. I'm slightly, or maybe cautiously optimistic. One thing, I think Daniel gave us a very good account of, look, the reality. There's a lot of it out there, it's sophisticated, and as Preston said, you know, we don't see in the short term it disappearing. Another thing that I didn't hear anybody talk about was the impact. Actually, we're sitting here in Industry City, and we're seeing these new vertical industries digitize, and where in the past we were talking always about security, I think now there's an element of safety. And actually, Martin, we had this conversation yesterday. There's an element of safety. And personal experience in Ireland this year, just last year, the health service suffered a ransomware attack, and literally the entire country's health system shut down from the digital point of view. And I've no doubt people died. I'm sure they did, because they couldn't get surgery that was scheduled or whatever. And the same goes for the automotive or factories or, you know, mixing chemicals, whatever. So there is that element of risk that there maybe never has been before, that we need to be very much aware of, and from that point of view design industry-specific security solutions. But it's not all doom and gloom. Bear in mind, 3GPP, the 5G standards people, have about 40, I think, in the security working group, have about 40 projects, I don't know. And they're drawing conclusions from those projects all the time, and the conclusions get put into the standards. And that brings us to security by design, and I think that's the solution to the IoT problem that Justin mentioned. You know, that we need to get better at security by design, and I think it's the standards ecosystem that's going to drive that agenda.
Perfect, thanks very much. We've literally got a couple of minutes left, so I just wanted us to turn our focus a little bit more to the future as well, cognizant of 5G and the changes that that's going to bring and bring us forward looking. Maybe very quick answer, Alex, what's your crystal ball for the future security topics that we should be thinking about for 5G?
I mean, what we have to bear in mind for 5G is the current version is not cloud native. I think Ian Levy and others talked about this in the previous session. It's still following currently a slightly older security model. So the first thing we are going to see more of in terms of that crystal ball gazing is 5G evolve to be slightly more cloud native. O-RAN is one component of that. But the second bit for me is the arrival of AI and ML into the network automation space. A lot of the threats and vulnerabilities, the supply chain attacks to it and how it integrates are radically different to the security challenges we've had before. The problem space that it sits in is not the same. And I think there's a tendency for people to assume it's just more of what we had before, just with AI in it. And that's too simplistic. So for me, that will be the big sort of shining star of challenge if we were to come back and do this in another couple of years' time, or indeed for 2023.
I think that wraps us up nicely. I think we're out of time, but so apologies for the other panelists. We couldn't get to the answer all that one question, but I think you've made a series of good points there, Alex, so thanks very much. I'd really like to thank the panelists, so if you put your hands together, and to thank them for their contribution. I mentioned the security landscape report. I've got a few copies here if you want to come and grab one. Otherwise, feel free to download off the website. And we're done. Thank you very much.